So I'd just like to start off by welcoming you to this final lecture of our series for 2022-2023. My name is Nick Gallant, and I'm a professor here at UCL, that's what it says here, so I think I am, and I'm chairing the event this evening. So tonight's lecture is a special event. It's our annual Sir Peter Hall lecture, named in honour of our colleague who passed away 9 years ago, back in 2014. Peter was very, very well known in the field of urban planning, urban policy, and he was an inspiration to many, many people, many scholars, many people in practice. You can go to planning departments around the world and they'll have very few academic texts, but if they have any, often they're those of Peter Hall. So he was an inspirational figure, and we like to use this event to remember Peter and his work. And we do that by bringing here to London a speaker whose own work will resonate very much with Peter's research and interests. I should add that Peter's wife, Magda Hall, Lady Magda Hall, also passed away a few weeks ago. And she was also, like Peter, a great friend of the Bartlett School of Planning. And I saw Magda a few times over the last few years, and we were working to try and bring Peter's books and his various papers to UCL as a resource for research. Magda has actually bequeathed Peter's papers and a small endowment fund to allow us to archive them at UCL if we find any space to put them in. That's the next task for the head of school, current and future. And then hopefully those resources, Peter's papers, will be archived properly and will be available for research. So, as I said right at the beginning, this lecture tonight is the culmination of a series that we've run this year. And that series started in October when Professor Tuna Tassenkok from Amsterdam came here and spoke on urban governance. That was followed in December by Francesco Chiadelli coming and talking on housing informality. And then after Christmas, we heard from our own Claire Collomb, who spoke on platform urbanism and Airbnb. We were due to hear from Franklin Obeng-Adum in March, but his talk fell victim to the industrial action, but he will be here in next year's programme, which we will shortly be advertising, so you can put it all in your diaries, and we can get the catering right, and we'll have more of a party atmosphere in future, though I'm not saying there isn't one tonight. Anyway, less of that. I'd like to just now introduce this evening's speaker. Margaret Crawford is Professor of Architecture at the University of California, Berkeley. She teaches courses in the history and theory of architecture and on urbanism and urban history. Her research focuses on the evolution, uses and meanings of urban space. And she's the author of a number of books on these subjects, most recently Everyday Urbanism, and a 4-volume compilation on urbanization in China. She's written widely on shopping malls, public space, and other issues in the American built environment. And recent research projects are focused on social change in China's Pearl River Delta and Californian ethno-burbs. So Margaret has been the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards that have allowed her to teach and conduct research all around the world. The topic of her lecture tonight is Everyday Urbanism for Planners, focused on the value of everyday urbanism, of the everyday urbanism concepts, particularly for planning practice. And she's going to explain much more fully and much more eloquently exactly what that means. So there'll of course be an opportunity for questions at the end, and the refreshments are already out, so we'll get to those in due course. So Margaret, without further ado from me, please, the floor is yours, and welcome to UCL.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for inviting me. This lecture has been planned a long time. It was possibly going to be on Zoom, so I'm much happier to be here in person. And I'm also very happy to deliver the Sir Peter Hall lecture, because Peter Hall was my predecessor at UC Berkeley for a number of years, and I'm a fan of his work, which I know very well, and I would just say that my favorite book by Sir Peter Hall is Great Planning Disasters, which if you haven't read it, especially students, please read it, because not only is it an account of some really dramatic failures of planning, but it also offers a model that is still useful today about how to analyze urban development and urban planning. So I'm going to give you a brief history of the idea of everyday urbanism, how it appeared and how it's evolved over time. A caveat, this is very Los Angeles centric, so I hope that this isn't too parochial a topic. I have researched everyday urbanism in China and other places, but I think Los Angeles really has the most vivid demonstration of what it's all about. Okay, this concept emerged in the late 1980s in Los Angeles with two colleagues, both urban designers, John Chase and John Kaliski. So it's quite old, 25 years, maybe even slightly older. And then we published several books outlining what this concept is. The first one in 1999 on the left, and the expanded version in 2008. And just to give you a sense of the cover, this is a mural on the side of a liquor store in Los Angeles near the Santa Monica freeway, and it says Santa Monica Lewinsky. If you remember the Clinton administration, maybe you're too young. Anyway, I do other things, as Nick said, but during these time, I've continued to research everyday urbanism topics, and I actually still believe that they are very relevant and useful today, even though so much time has passed. Now, the book came out of a situation in Los Angeles in around 1990, and we looked around us and we saw what was going on in the city, which was very uninspiring because it was really about very generic and normative planning ideas applied, just as they were being basically applied in every city in the United States and in some cases even around the world. So I think you know what all this stuff is, and this is really what Los Angeles was doing, because many people in the city, including city officials and a lot of urban planners, considered that Los Angeles was not really a good city and it had to come up to the level of other cities. So this is a planning practice, and you can see all of these things in Los Angeles today. They happened. And urban design discourse in the city was actually also very discouraging, because it was polarized between two, to us, very unpromising options. One was new urbanism, even though you'd think Los Angeles is not a very likely place to have new urbanism. In fact, large areas of the city were attempting to be designers were urging them to redevelop them along new urbanist lines. And then the other option, equally unpromising, was a kind of avant-garde speculative practice, which was based on things like overlapping different town plans and extruding plans from that. So this isn't what we saw in the streets of Los Angeles as we looked around us during our lives. Oops. This is what we saw. And it really denied what the image of Los Angeles was. The idea that it was a place notorious for its complete absence of street life. And there are many jokes about this, and even a song called Nobody Walks in LA. But actually, what we saw that the city had changed. It was still car-oriented, but its sidewalks and parking lots exploded with new and surprising activities, and there was an incredible amount of human vitality visible everywhere. Recent immigrants sold oranges from the median strip, vendors lined up along sidewalks, mobile food vendors roamed around the city, creating temporary restaurants in different parts of the city, bringing unexpected groups of people together for a meal. Mini malls filled with mom and pop businesses becoming a staple of Los Angeles life. Even ordinary spaces like this oil change place showed an unexpected capacity for shape-shifting. And so this auto body store closed at 5 o'clock every day and then reopened after 10 more minutes as an outdoor taqueria, grilling up carne asada to attract passerbys. In quiet neighborhoods, residents transformed their driveways, lawns, or even the city-owned grassy verge into public places. So unlike the previous generation of auto-generated commerce based on very impersonal drive-throughs, this new commerce suggested human contact, and it required interchange as part of the transaction. So everyday urbanism is a reflection of all these things that we saw literally every day on city streets. And we wanted to place people and their daily experiences at the center of this intellectual enterprise. So we looked for a way, actually, to explore the dimensions. So this started empirically, but obviously we looked to theories to start to explain it to us. And we quickly discovered, obviously, the work of Henri Lefebvre, which had come out in English not so long ago. And his work told us that the commonplace and even trivial aspects of life were worthy of sustained interest, and that, in fact, everyday life constituted the basis of all social experience and should be the realm of political contestation. And so this opened up this territory as something that you should take seriously and not just see it as a kind of curiosity in the city. And so what we learned basically from Lefebvre is that you should focus on the ordinary rather than the exceptional, and look for significance in concrete practices rather than abstract concepts. Okay. And so just a few examples of abstract concepts. Really focusing on specificity rather than generalizations or quantifications. And so everyday urbanism, if we take Lefebvre's work seriously, is an attempt to eliminate existing hierarchies between interesting and ordinary. And it suggests that every place is equally worthy of consideration. We particularly found his warnings about the relationship between experts and everyday life very relevant. We felt that many planners and designers avoided everyday life at their peril. As Lefebvre pointed out, experts and intellectuals are embedded in everyday life, but they prefer to think of themselves as outside and elsewhere. Convinced that everyday life is trivial, they attempt to evade it. They use rhetoric and meta-language as permanent substitutes for experience. And now you can find many books explaining Lefebvre's theories, but we actually were not interested in doing that. And I think many people who are the experts on Lefebvre consider us to be really illegitimate hijackers of his work. And particularly because the book Everyday, his books about everydayness are very ambiguous. And that's why there's so many books written about them. But we saw this as an opportunity basically to just take what we needed from them and use them really as a interpretive perspective to look at the city. Now, at this time, Los Angeles was considered to be a troubled city. It was a city in crisis. Many actually thought that it was finished as a city. The Immigration Act of 1965 had opened the borders of the United States to a kind of vast new group of immigrants. And Los Angeles's blooming economy attracted people from Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. It was often called America's new Ellis Island. And immigration transformed the ethnic and racial makeup of not only Los Angeles, but Southern California, making it one of the most diverse in the US. Los Angeles was one of the first majority-minority cities. And by 1990, more than 40% of the population was not born in the United States. And this led to many struggles, issues. The 1992 civil unrest was a dramatization of the tensions that this massive demographic change had brought, exacerbated by economic crisis. It was widely understood to be an African-American revolt, but in fact, Central Americans and Mexicans were the largest numbers of people who participated. There was extreme tension between Korean shop owners and African-American population. At the same time, or published in around 1990, just before the riots, Mike Davis's important book, City of Quartz, depicted Los Angeles in apocalyptic terms. And in fact, he saw many of the things that we looked at in a very, very negative way, seeing many malls and street vendors as symptoms of a collapsing public realm and a multi-ethnic city verging on the verge of implosion. But we actually looked and saw something completely different from that. We saw that it was a realm that appeared trivial, problematic, but in fact opened the door to considerations of all kinds of issues that are considered to be important, such as economic, politics, society, and culture. So over time, everyday urbanism actually attracted many supporters. It was a way of engaging with the city that people responded to and that it actually had maybe even secretly liked. And because we gave it a name, that actually allowed it to be defined as a particular kind of city. And in fact, lowercase everyday urbanism became a kind of shorthand to describe this kind of places and environment. In 2005, Doug Helbaugh, who is the dean of the University of Michigan, gave a series of conferences in which he recognized everyday urbanism as one of the three dominant paradigms in urbanism. Now, this is obviously not true. It's even laughable. But at the same time, it actually meant that somebody was, in fact, listening to us and recognizing us. And everyday urbanism was also heavily criticized, largely, but not exclusively, by planning professionals who did actually consider it relatively meaningless, small scale. I'm not going to go into all the criticisms, although in the second version of the book, I list them all. But I think that they didn't really understand that this is not supposed to replace existing planning paradigms. Obviously, they're not going to go away. You cannot plan new things with everyday urbanism. And so basically, it's intended as a kind of critique and corrective to conventional planning without imagining that somehow it is actually going to disappear. But it can work alongside, over top of, or after existing planning initiatives. Everyday urbanism is also confused with other urbanisms that were starting to appear, such as tactical urbanism or guerrilla urbanism, or even older approaches like advocacy planning. And all of these other types of urbanism are very different in the sense that they are highly intentional. And the people who produce everyday urbanism are not actually intending to produce urbanism. Urbanism is simply a byproduct of their lives and of their economic activities and other things that they are actively pursuing. And finally, since The 1990s, I've been working with my husband, Marco Chinzati, there in China, working with Chinese planners and others who are interested in everyday urbanism, which is, of course, widespread in China. And that led to the book being recently translated and published in China. So everyday urbanism describes an almost infinite variety of practices, activities, and even buildings, a rich and complex urban realm. There are so many examples, and I'm just going to talk about 3 today. Street vending, I think you can see street vending. Mini malls, which are right there, and yard sales, or garage sales as they're known. And so these practices, I think, really demonstrate the claims that Lefebvre makes that what might appear as trivial actually lead to much, much larger issues. Now, I think that planners can learn some lessons from attending very carefully, observing and understanding everyday urbanism for a variety of reasons. One important reason is they're actually functional. It's hard to find a vendor who does not have customers, right? So they satisfy actually different needs. And here, not talking about LA, but just some examples. In New York and many other cities, I don't know if this happens in London, the second it starts to rain, a vendor will appear on the street selling $5 umbrellas. And so many people, here's some testimony from people on the internet talking about their umbrella that they have bought, that they own 20. In Los Angeles, vendors, especially fruit vendors, are so popular that there are a lot of attention on Yelp and other social media devoted to recommendations about how great they are and where you can usually find them, what corner you can usually find them on. So here's 5-star recommendations for different fruit vendors. This guy, Joe, selling fruit, which is something that you find on nearly every corner in Los Angeles. So if there are no customers, there wouldn't be any vendors. Vendors show up when nightclubs close right outside at 2 a.m. selling bacon-wrapped hot dogs, which is exactly what you need after a night of drinking. So they really know their customers. They are important. And so vendors are everywhere in Los Angeles. You will find them everywhere, but until very recently, vending was completely illegal in the city. And so this has recently changed. And so all over the city, I think you can see vendors have appropriated these marginalized and overlooked sites that are chosen for their accessibility to passing motorists, passing pedestrians. They sell everything from tube socks to homemade jewelry to every single conceivable kind of food. And often they locate in vacant lots. Now, many observers imagined, or even casual passersby, imagine that these are just desperate people forced out into the street just to get a few dollars. But in fact, they are rational economic actors who operate micro enterprises. And you can see from these images that most vendors are immigrants or come from marginalized populations. Often they face barriers, language barriers and cultural barriers to formal employment. And for women, and many vendors are women, vending offers flexible hours that allows them time to care for children and households. For some, vending can be the lowest rung of the commercial ladder, leading to more permanent businesses. In a city of extreme social and economic inequalities, vending provides a low entry but important form of economic survival. Vending is also political, and as you can see from the t-shirts, multiple groups have organized around legalizing vendors, increasing their efficiency, for example, electronic payments, et cetera, and representing them in the most important arena, which is the public sphere of public opinion, where opinion is formed that ultimately will have an impact on them. So vending is turned into an important political issue. Vending also offers, and the activities of vendors offer new concepts for thinking about cities. These cheap rugs draped over cars and fences cover the harshness of the chain link fences that are ubiquitous in Los Angeles, and they overlay them with the soft texture and bright patterns of the interior, defining collective living rooms and evoking a multiplicity of dwelling places, an analog for the diversity of the city. Selling used clothes on these chain link fences bring these urban spaces to life. And really these used clothing from a variety of closets creates a kind of mural of different identities that have contributed to this clothing. They offer both aesthetic and culinary delight. The delicate patterning of iridescent paper, flowers, and pillows, the softness of stuffed animals, all of these evoke the intimacy of the interior rather than the no man's land of the street. Vendors also bring their specialties to a broad audience by selling unique foods and regional specialties, everything from Louisiana gumbo to Oaxacan tacos to Sinaloan tamales. And you will find incredible venues, some Thai food on the left, incredible examples of very, very specific regional specialties at vendors in Los Angeles. They also introduce new principles into the city. In public places, familiar items such as tables, chairs, and tablecloths, usually seen inside the house, transform neglected and underused spaces into islands of human occupation. And here they suggest principles that we already know, such as the principle of defamiliarization, the artistic and modernist cultural technique of making something strange, and therefore you start to see it for the first time, but also a new concept which we can call refamiliarization, which makes the city less strange but more home-like. And we can also see this in these women who, wearing their aprons, sell food at their home, which emphasizes the domestic quality of these enterprises, selling a very unpromising, I think you can see, physical locations, but domesticating them through through their own behavior. So these temporary uses really change the meanings of these urban spaces in dramatic and notable ways that I think planners can actually learn from. These public spaces basically become occupied by citizens, although many of these people may not be official citizens. Mini malls. In the 1980s, a new building type appeared all over Los Angeles on corner sites that were vacated by gas stations that were put out of business by the 1973 oil crisis. Cheaply built and designed for quick, convenient automotive commerce, mini malls quickly attracted immigrants who wanted to start small businesses. In Los Angeles, immigrants constitute an unusually large number of business owners, a situation that economists call hyper-entrepreneurialism. Immigrants own a high percentage of so-called Main Street businesses, convenience stores, dry cleaners, laundromats, and other neighborhood shops and services. They also occupy a lot of ethnic niches, such as the donut shops. Donut shops in Los Angeles are dominated by Cambodian immigrants. They found their own niches. They provide specialized ethnic goods and services. And so by the early 1990s, there were more than 3,000 mini malls in Los Angeles. This led one of the city council people to call Los Angeles the mini mall capital of the world, and that was not intended as a compliment. There are plastic signs juxtaposing English with Hangul, Thai, Armenian, and Chinese serve as an index of the city's different neighborhoods, a visible demonstration of the demographic shifts that have occurred there. Each mini mall's unique retail mixture, a wildly heterogeneous assemblages of stock shops and services, reflect the everyday needs of their customers. And at the same time, the cheap rents made mini malls the location for the best ethnic restaurants in Los Angeles. Now, I've focused on immigrants, poor, and marginalized people, but everyday urbanism is also found among middle and even the upper classes who actively also produce this kind of everyday urbanism. And for example, the garage sale. I looked on the internet to say that if there were garage sales in the UK, and it said yes. Is that true? Maybe. But the garage sale is where people use their front yard or their driveway. They never actually occur in garages because that's where all the stuff is, but in the driveway. So people use their front yard to sell worn out personal items. This happens all over the city of Los Angeles, even in the wealthiest neighborhoods. And in fact, my own study of garage sales began when I read in the newspaper that Beverly Hills had started restricting garage sales to 2 a year. And that was because in the 1990s, during the economic crisis, even people in Beverly Hills were having garage sales every weekend just in order to augment their income or to survive. Los Angeles has more probably, it's probably also the garage sales center of the world because you can count on 9 months without rain. There is a large number of single-family houses that have front yards and driveways. And so almost every weekend, you can drive around the city and see innumerable garage sales. And in fact, a survey in Southern California found that more than half of the population in the region had attended a garage sale in the previous year. So they're very, very popular and pervasive. But they're economically invisible, right? Because all of the exchange is done without taxation, even reporting, income tax, et cetera. But I would also argue that the garage sale has transformational urban qualities. It mixes the commercial with the domestic, and this really alters the meaning of the front lawn or the driveway, transforming it into a liminal space for a few hours or days, inverting the usual meaning of the house. It creates a public space that was previously a private space, and in fact, not in California, but in some states, you can actually shoot somebody who comes on your front lawn because they are considered to be trespassing. So it is a private space that for a few hours becomes an extremely public space. Anybody walking down the street or driving up can actually come to the garage sale. They can touch or even buy your former possessions that were previously in the most private spaces of the houses, the drawer, the closet, the basement, or the attic. And this creates a very unique kind of sociability because it's actually in front of your own dwelling. It creates a situation where the seller is like a host and the buyer is like a guest. And so this kind of sociability You typically need to converse with the buyer before buying something. You can't just hand over your money. And so that results in a sort of generalized friendliness and an overall egalitarian style of exchange. Garage sales attract people from all walks of life. There are people whose hobby is garage sales, and they're mostly women. They're called sailors. In fact, poor people often go to rich neighborhoods to shop at garage sales because they think that the quality of the goods will be higher and the people selling it will not need the money so much, so they will have better prices. And it's also one of the few places in American culture where you can actually bargain. So garage sales are really important places. And beneath the surface of these apparently commercial transactions, there are alternative economies at play. First of all, the garage sale is a small part of the extensive network of recycling, but unlike the best known forms of recycling, like the trash that we actually put to be recycled, that recycling involves complex manufacturing processes, but garage sales are extremely efficient forms of recycling existing goods, which they simply recirculate. Since the items have already been bought, paid for, and used, they offer a windfall to the seller, and then they go on to have a second life with a new buyer. According to their value, they can move up and down the commodity chain to become desirable collectives or basically garbage. And typically in garage sale, prices are extremely low and use value almost always trumps exchange value, or else the two are inextricably mixed. The other hidden economy is the gift economy. And garage sale sellers are often give away the items that they have, particularly as you come to the end of the garage sale. They'll give you stuff. They're often free boxes filled with items that anyone can take away. And you could even say that since garage sale prices are so low, giveaway prices, the items themselves are almost quasi or partial gifts. And so often the exchange of money is primarily symbolic, a way of avoiding the appearance of charity. And sometimes garage sales are held so regularly that they become off-the-books retail stores with the garage used as a warehouse and sales space. And I found many examples of this in my research. So this mixture of retail and residential and commercial use really alarms planners and officials because it undermines the basic principles of the organization of the American city, which is zoning, right? Zoning imposes a functional segregation of uses that I think you can see that this really violates. And so the permanent garage sale is a bottom-up challenge to this. Bringing commercial activities into domestic environments really breaks down the rigid barriers between the home, the neighborhood, and the rest of the city. But they also reveal a really imaginative use of single-family houses. And it shows you an alternative concept of what mixed use might be like. Unlike professionally designed mixed-use buildings or live-work lofts, which are expensive, require zoning and code changes, the garage sale store costs almost nothing and offers extremely flexible space. And so this is a potentially more creative way of bringing new and mixed use into neighborhoods without vacant land, new construction, or high cost. You can even make your home into a restaurant. And amazingly, the state of California recently passed a regulations allowing people to use their houses where they can cook and sell food. And so this makes it possible to rethink the single-family house as both a domestic workplace and as a commercial venue. So nobody can really explain why this happened in the state of California, but all of a sudden it did. So we can also look behind the purely commercial dimension to find other kinds of transformative everyday activities. This is the Bordertown Skate Park, which was built by skaters bringing in bags of concrete at night over a very long period of time. It lasted for 10 years and was a very, very popular venue. And you can see it's under the freeway, so it took advantage of this unused space. And so it was a very, very popular place. This is the Buddha of Oakland. The homeowner there in the gray house on the corner was really upset because there was this empty triangular space that belonged to the city, but no one used it. So he found a concrete Buddha statue at the hardware store. He put it out there because he thought it would keep people from dumping trash. But in fact, there were a lot of Vietnamese residents in the neighborhood who adopted it. And you can see they built a shrine around it. They added other Buddha statues. They bring offerings and actually hold services there now. And obviously, no one is dumping trash anymore. The backyard squabbles is a local resident was distressed that some people in his neighborhood, some of the young men, were joining gangs and shooting each other. So he created this backyard squabbles, which was a boxing ring in his backyard where they could come and actually fight it out among themselves. And it attracted other enterprises, so you could then get a haircut there or buy fried chicken as well. And again, this became a regular activity in the neighborhood. So by the mid-2000s, all of these activities had found their champions and become legitimized by academic studies, celebrated by well-known artists and writers, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning food writer Jonathan Gold, who was a champion of vendor food and mini malls. And he introduced his many readers to the wealth of ethnic cuisines that could be found in Los Angeles. TripAdvisor and Yelp offer a list of the best street vendors in the city. And so these activities, instead of being a source of embarrassment, became a point of pride and recognized as a permanent dynamic in the city's development. They attracted many supporters, particularly among young people, and hipsters even started locating their bars and stores in mini malls. But in spite of this recognition, these activities are threatened. This raises difficult and perplexing questions about the nature of regulation and deregulations. Regulations are complicated to create, but undoing them is even more complicated and sometimes almost impossible. And so recent developments highlight the uncertain and again, paradoxical outcomes that recent attempts to both legitimate and eliminate everyday urbanism have produced. There have been a long struggle to legalize street vending, but the results are very contradictory. Street vending was legalized in the state of California in 2018, in the city of Los Angeles in 2020, but the results have been really unpromising. Out of an estimated 20,000 vendors, 50,000 vendors, only 200 of them have been able to acquire permits. And that's because permitting requirements are really difficult for most of the vendors that we have seen to actually meet. Even the custom-made vending carts that they have, there is a actually specialized industry in Los Angeles that makes vending carts, do not meet their requirements. The permits are expensive. The instructions are difficult and confusing. Most of the most popular vending locations are actually prohibited. And so vending now is actually more difficult than it was when it was illegal. Since it's legally and officially legal, a new group of vending enforcers has been created to, again, confiscate the goods and fine the vendors. So paradoxically, legalization has actually produced a worse situation for vendors. Vendors who organize themselves into a really popular night market were actually shut down, and again, leaving 100 of them without a place to vend. Mini malls are an even more complicated story. They became a favorite target of city officials and planners. And between 1989, many cities instituted restrictions or sometimes outright bans. And so they wanted to control the setbacks, parking, elevations, access, everything. And so this is one of the almost very few mini malls built that actually satisfies all of the requirements. I think you can see here, there's parking is in the back. It has some kind of architectural interest to it. It has a sign on the corner. So instead of the empty corner, that was a real problem for a lot of, especially urban designers, because it goes absolutely contrary to everything that urban designers see as correct. Really, what was the crime? The crime was mostly visual blight, which I think they're always many malls were described as universally ugly. The Bordertown Skate Park, Caltrans, the California Department of Transportation, destroyed it in 2011. And here, a representative of the California Athletic Commission showed up at the backyard boxing match and gave a cease and desist order because getting this boxing ring license would be a expensive and complicated procedure. So I think at the last thing that I heard, they are investigating if they can do it, but it's pretty unlikely. Oh, oops. And again, backyard restaurants, this is something that seemed really promising, but turned out, again, in spite of legalization, to be really difficult. A number of people started restaurants, but very few have actually succeeded in operating them for any length of time because there are a lot of different regulations. One of the most onerous is that you cannot have any hired employees. You can only have a single employee who's making the food and doing everything else. So it makes it very, very difficult to operate them, even though there is a lot of interest in having these micro enterprises and cottage industries from home. So how can planners think about this? Are these stories of more than just ethnographic anecdotes? And what is the future of all of these everyday endeavors? And I feel that planners can play a really active role in both the theory and practice of transforming their operations in the city. Is the situation, like Michel de Certeau posits, an eternal struggle between strategies and tactics, where at the end of the day, possessing space and owning space and controlling space will always win out over seizing opportunities in time? And so, however creative, do tactics always have to remain temporary? And the sheer number of the activities that I have described, repeated over and over across time, suggests that through repetition, these activities should require a kind of power that transcends the powers of strategies and acquire a proper place. Exactly what that proper place is not clear, however. On the other hand, because planners are highly involved actors in many of these situations, do they simply accept that relationship in which tactics are always temporary and the power of strategies always prevails. Can we imagine ways of rethinking this relationship in planning theory in practice? Is there such a thing as the oxymoronic concept of flexible regulation, since regulation is not supposed to be flexible? But given the significance of these activities, it seems that, and what's at stake here, it seems that regulation needs to be far more flexible than it is. The other thing is to really rethink rights, and the right to work and the right to livelihoods should be acknowledged as a basic human right in the city. And I think you can see that when day laborers on the top and vendors advocate for themselves, they always do it under the concept of rights and the right to a livelihood. And also, one of the interesting things is, can we consider the relationship between informality in cities in advanced countries, such as the US and the global South? In 1991, in the early 90s, in the situation that I described, David Reef wrote this book, Los Angeles, Capital of the Third World. And obviously that was a negative characterization. But I think that the understanding of the relationship of the global South to today makes it possible to reconsider a lot of these activities in a more positive light. And articles such as Abdul Malik Simone's famous article about people as infrastructure really suggest that they can be seen, these activities can be seen as new and positive additions rather than violations of the conditions that advance, normative conditions that advanced countries should have. So I'd just like to conclude to say, in a more utopian vein, it would be very, very nice to have a heteroglossic understanding of the city. And this is an idea taken from the Russian literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin. And the idea is that heteroglossy occurs in a dialogic context in which everything becomes relativized, deprivileged, and aware of competing definitions for the same things. And this would really mean to transform absolute or authoritarian ideas and behavior into an even playing field. So thank you.
We certainly have time for questions. I mean, just on your own question about whether we have garage sales, we do, but I think they're quite infrequent. I see them occasionally up in East Finchley, but I don't think it's the thing that we do. But in the 1980s, I was a regular attendant at car boot sales, although I think that they are probably, they don't serve the same purpose because they're concentrated. They move around and they're flexible and they're slightly illegal, but you know, they don't really open up the family home in the same way. When you talked about flexible regulation, I just wondered whether colleagues here would have any reflections, and this might come out in the discussion, on the sort of support that discretionary planning in the UK gives to these sorts of everyday urbanisms. Because obviously you were talking about zoning and the rigidity of zoning and separation of uses in the US, but of course the planning system and the regulation that sits within that system in the UK is rather different. So maybe that's something that will come up in the conversation. So, questions? We have three. Start at the back, and then we'll progress.
Nine Elms Flea Market is very good.
I can't actually hear.
Nine Elms Flea Market in
I can't hear you on.
Nine Elms Flea Market in Covent Garden, New Covent Garden, is a really, really great space to visit. Experience some of the things you were showing. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I found it really, really fascinating, the talk. As I said, Nine Elms Flea Market is a fantastic space. It happens on Sundays. It's not going to be there forever, so it's good to go and see it. It's like the biggest kind of car boot sale in London.
Thank you.
I was sort of inspired that maybe you're giving this challenge of how we can open up planning to think about planning in a different way. And it made me think of how Mark Fisher describes like capitalist realism as a kind of pervasive atmosphere. It made me think more like how we can change the way we work within planning departments, like change the culture of planning, as opposed to necessarily a different form of design code or something. That said, I think what you said about mixed use, I found really fascinating. I think a lot of local plans in the UK still use site allocations policies, which use floor to area ratios, and it'd be really interesting to challenge that and say, how can we imagine that the same floor space gets used for two things? It's a really, really, really great question. Yeah, I had just one question really, which is, over the last decades, how have people in the groups you described, like immigrants or other groups you described, how have they responded to some of the kind of observations, I wouldn't say theorize, yeah, observations and sort of theories that you've proposed? Or is that something that is part of your practice, like engaging with them, or are they purely an observed kind of...
Well, I think that it has had an impact, not so much on me, because I actually don't live in Los Angeles anymore. But I do think that there are many people who have adopted this perspective who actually are working with local groups. And there's a huge number of, I would say, advocate groups and community groups and corporations that work with vendors and others. I think that they're very responsive to it. Clearly, we have done some work with them, but I guess I also see our task as, again, in the public sphere, as removing middle-class opposition by legitimizing these things, because that is one of the biggest obstacles, is, either homeowners or simply middle-class voters. And I think that this has done a lot to legitimize these particular activities. And in a way, the more prestigious the institution you come from, the more coverage you get in the newspaper, and that actually convinces people that this is something worth paying attention to.
Margaret, thank you so much. Wonderful lecture. I'm an architect, so perhaps a different perspective on the topic, but I couldn't help thinking that perhaps in your definition, what you're offering is maybe in a negative form, a definition of urbanism and planning, somehow, like per via negativa. By telling us what everyday urbanism is, you might be also defining something fundamental about urbanism at its core, or something maybe that is evident in America that is not evident in this context where urbanism is kind of sedimented discipline of sorts.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I guess my question is, do you think by defining everyday urbanism, what you're actually pointing to is a characteristic of urbanism at its core, that it's constantly trying to grapple with this slippery sense of the commons that is constantly being grafted somehow on top of the city?
Yeah, I mean, yes, clearly, I think that is something that is essential. It's, I guess someone like Michel de Certeau would see this as eternal. And even if you look at American planning history, the battle about street vending goes back to the late 19th century in Los Angeles. I think probably the further back you look, you constantly are seeing a struggle between, from emerging practices and controlling those practices. So definitely it is something that has been there for a very, very long time. So I think it is an essential quality of urbanism, or of urban life. Yeah.
Me next, I think. I was very interested in the example you gave with the minimal that had been got through the urban designers, and you gave a sense that actually it sort of destroyed the everyday urbanism through the design strategy that had been employed. And I just wondered what, with that view, what should urban designers be doing to maybe support this type of activity in their design practices?
Well, actually, the interesting thing is that I think it has to do with a much larger discourse of normative urbanism that in the 2000s in Los Angeles really emerged, in which the city started to think that it should be more like cities and have street walls and even cornice lines and no empty corners and not so many parking lots and better public transportation. But again, which may be fine, but in the course of that, it was actually very destructive to existing practices. So I feel that many urban designers are really guided by normative practices rather than simply looking at what's there and working with it. And certainly our number one principle is work with what's there. And most urban designers have always been very dissatisfied with Los Angeles. And now the city actually, because it has become much, much denser, is adopting some of the normative urban design practices. But mini malls, for example, are not going away. The lots are too small to really build housing or anything else on them. And they are so convenient and useful that they're not disappearing. But, for example, Frank Gehry actually designed a kind of mini mall. So there are many options of how they could have evolved. And, the example is pretty terrible, in fact, I think, worse than the originals. So I think it's just a question of really looking around and not accepting normative answers because, then every city starts to look alike. And each city really has very, very unique qualities. And Los Angeles more than many. Okay.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I think one of the things that it shows is about things being organic and evolving, from that sort of existing community. And I suppose my question to you and to others is really, certainly in London, you've got developers who take a site and sort of think of it being mixed use. They say, we'll put a bit here, a bit there. But what they're often taking away is the space that the existing community have occupied and used. And you lose that sort of connectivity, and I think it's something about engaging with existing communities and understanding how that site, etc., works within that area. And I think the other thing is that loss, with the digital divide, etc., that sort of informal community, that engagement that sort of supports health and well-being in space. So I don't know how you deal with it, but I think there's something about making sure that things are much more knitted into the economic and social fabric. But that point you made about sort of once it becomes legal, it becomes, it's a bit more enforced, and then it loses that whole.
Yeah, I think it's complicated. In Los Angeles now, the mixed use has become regulated, but the bottom floors are always empty, and so that the ideal and the reality completely diverge. And the most popular spaces are 100 years old, so-called taxpayer strips, which are one-story commercial buildings that are still, affordable and the best place to put your new business. So yeah, it's complicated. Yeah? Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, thanks for a very interesting talk, and I might have misunderstood what you're trying to say, but I saw your presentation as depicting this bottom-up, community-led, spontaneous appropriation of space in the city, especially ethnic minorities and deprived groups, and on the other hand, this regulatory bureaucracy that comes and then tries to shape what this community do according to patterns that are universal and apply everywhere. But I wonder whether it's actually a bit more complicated than that, because I could imagine, I don't know Los Angeles, but wonder whether those street vendors, for instance, at the same time that they are battling the bureaucracy, aren't they also perhaps battling small localized shops that are paying their taxes and feel a competition for them, and that boxing ring in the neighborhood, and it might be very good for those there, but might be a nightmare for the people living around it from the same community. So I wonder whether this there's a much more complicated set of things at play that prevents this everyday urbanism from being accepted and widespread.
Of course, you're absolutely right. It is more complicated. And definitely one of the struggles is between brick and mortar businesses and vendors, even though research has shown that actually vendors bring more customers to brick and mortar. And clearly having a boxing ring next door to your backyard is going to be contested. So I'm not saying that these aren't struggles and that this should just happen and everyone would be happy. No, I mean, in a way, there are a lot of struggles around this. And clearly, it's not a simple thing at all. And, you know, even street vendors, not all street vendors are even independent entrepreneurs. The people selling oranges on the street that used to be a feature of Los Angeles were actually kind of indentured salespeople who were selling the oranges to pay back the coyote that brought them over the border. So it isn't that it's a 100% optimistic and wonderful situation at all. There are a lot of contradictions built into it. And that's why regulation becomes so complicated and difficult.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. We're down to the last three questions now. So we've got one, Lee, sorry. Okay.
Hi. Is it? Yep. Thank you so much for the talk. I just had a point and a question about the urban design of strip malls versus this sort of now sort of prevailing orthodoxy of activated ground floor retail, you know, along the street frontage. And I think the reason why mini malls and strip malls work so well in LA is because the main arteries and commercial streets are often very wide and completely, you know, gridlocked with traffic. They're not really a pleasant place to walk down and spend time and patronize, you know, ground floor commercial retail in the sort of no setbacks model, whereas a mini mall creates sort of a street away from the street, you know, behind a parking lot, which perhaps is not ideal in conventional planning terms, but it, you know, when you go into a mini mall, you step into the shade, you have a whole frontage of businesses, and you know that street level space is activated with people, and so I was wondering if that sort of aligns with your thinking on mini malls and why they sort of endure as opposed to this more conventional model of street retail.
Yeah, absolutely. They're extremely convenient. And, you know, they're convenient for people who are driving by on their commute along these long arterial streets that make up Los Angeles' urban fabric. But they're also neighborhood places, and many people walk to them. And so the idea that they're anti-pedestrian is really not true because they reflect the neighborhood, but they're well used by neighborhoods. I used to live across the street from a mini mall, and I went there all the time. So, and I think many, many people do. Next.
Right. Thank you for a very stimulating talk. One simple question. How does your everyday urbanism fit with what Jane Jacobs has been arguing for decades? And how does it fit with Nicholas de Monchot's work on local codes and all that extra space?
Okay, that is an excellent question. Yeah, I mean, certainly people would connect us with Jane Jacobs. And Jane Jacobs is really important, I think, in drawing people's attention to the human dimension of cities. But at the same time, she was incredibly prescriptive in what she wanted because she said you have to have a certain kind of block. And certainly she was not in tune with even the realities of her own day. You know, she talked about all the cute Italian merchants on her Hudson Street, but in fact that was not the city that she inhabited. Which had been completely transformed by the so-called Second Great Migration, when more than 1 million African Americans moved to New York. Many people moved from Puerto Rico, which is something that she must have known about, but decided to completely ignore. So, I mean, I think that what she's really all about is hating the suburbs and trying to get people who would move to the suburbs to stay in New York. And so it's a very incomplete story. You know, Nicholas de Monchot's local code is, you know, interesting kind of compilation. This is a way of identifying kind of microsites in the city, which is an interesting compilation and a good idea, but nobody has taken advantage of it, probably through zoning and other regulations that make it impossible. I mean, in Japan, it would be occupied by something, but it's very difficult to happen in the US. So, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I would like to go back to the very beginning, where you basically started by identifying this rift or almost alienation between academic language about urbanism and the kind of vitality of everyday life. And it seems to be that a great motivation behind your work is bringing this vitality into academic discourse and its effects and its concepts and so on. And I guess my question is, what is the kind of intellectual hope beyond that, or what was the hope behind you doing this project? Because, for example, for Lefebvre, obviously, he was a Marxist. For him, it was like this everyday life was this big missing piece from the Marxist puzzle about the breakdown of capitalism. He had some grand transformative ambitions for this concept. And I'm just curious, like, what was your hope? Is it political? Is it about giving voice to the voiceless type thing? Or is it more just about documentation and the broadening of horizons?
Yeah, I would say all of the above. But it also has a concept of capitalism behind it that is really different than Lefebvre's very binary concept. And, you know, and I think a lot of urban scholars might think of capitalism as an incredibly oppressive system that governs everything. I'm thinking of, who's the guy from Planetary Urbanism? I forget his name. Brenner. Someone like Neil Brenner conceives of capitalism as this all-powerful, all-embracing force that has completely covered the entire planet. I see capitalism as a loosely woven fabric that has a lot of holes that can be widened through various kinds of activities, and even something that appears to be what people might call capitalism, such as commercial activities, actually, in a paradoxical way, work against it. So, yeah, but I also want to give voice to those, even though I think you can see they do have voices in the city. They're not voiceless by any means. But to actually, I feel that planning needs to be way more attentive to those groups, and especially in conditions of really exacerbated, I think, inequality. And certainly Los Angeles could be the poster child for exacerbated inequality. I don't know if you saw that Jay-Z just bought the most expensive house in California. So, you know, it's a dramatic situation. Is that it?
Okay, Margaret, thank you very much. We'll bring it to a close there, the questions, or the formal questions at least. You might like to know that Neil Brenner was here about 10 years ago, and he did expound on his theory of, planetary urbanization and, planetary capitalism. And I think he was accused of being an intellectual imperialist. So it was a very interesting discussion. But thank you very much for your talk this evening. It's provoked a lot of discussion, and I'm sure that discussion can continue over a glass of wine in a moment. So thank you again for being at UCL tonight.
Okay, thank you.